Hi everyone. My name's Kyleigh. I am the Head of Business Development at the Scottish Commission for People with Learning Disabilities. I've been with the organisation now about a year, and I'm responsible for creating partnerships and income generation. I'm joined today by Lindsay. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lindsay Kinloch, and I've come with a wide range of skills, including training and self-advocacy. I've been advocating from a very, very young age, from school, and I went into training and self-advocacy. And today I'm going to be sharing a bit about my own experience and what accessible housing and what a good home means to me.
So before we get on to that good stuff, I'll tell you a wee bit more about SCLD. So we've been around for almost 25 years now. The organisation was established in 2001 as part of the Scottish Consortium for Learning Disability. Then in December 2015, we changed formation and name and became the Scottish Commission for People with Learning Disabilities. So today we are a human rights defender organisation, working to uphold and protect and raise awareness of the human rights of people with learning disabilities. Our vision is of a fairer Scotland where people with learning disabilities can live full, safe, loving and equal lives. And despite what our name suggests, we are actually a charity. Our work focuses on human rights, leadership and evidence. We aim to influence the development of policy, practice and legislation and culture change, and that's all done in collaboration with people with learning disabilities. Do you want to tell us what a learning disability actually is, Lindsay?
So what exactly is a learning disability? I actually have a learning disability myself, and I also have a physical disability along with other health conditions. Quite often this is the case for a lot of people with a learning disability. We will often have a dual diagnosis. So a learning disability is different for everyone. It challenges us in a wide variety of situations. In all cases, a learning disability is lifelong. A learning disability affects quite a lot of the things that we can do, but we can still speak up, and we want to. That's something that we want to be doing more. Someone with a learning disability can experience many barriers, in particular, accessing our human rights. A person with a learning disability can experience stigma, poorer outcomes in lots of different situations across a wide range of issues. Those include housing, choosing where we want to live, education, transport, health, and many more situations. And these are the things that we ourselves are trying to change for everybody with different kinds of disabilities.
So I think it's important to make the distinction between a learning disability and a learning difficulty. So a learning difficulty can include learning or emotional problems that can affect a person's ability to learn and sometimes their ability to get on with others. There's some stats on the screen there. Around 40% of autistic children are also diagnosed with a learning disability, and around 25% of children diagnosed with ADHD also have a learning disability. The term learning disability and learning difficulty, they are often used interchangeably, and this leads to a lot of confusion. Recently, that's been further complicated with a move towards neurodivergence as an umbrella term. The term is probably most appropriate when discussing conditions like ADHD and dyslexia, for example, but the complication is where does learning disability sit within that umbrella term. The issue of learning disability's relationship to the term neurodivergence was something that was being consulted on as part of the recent Scottish Government's Learning Disability, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill, or the LDAN bill, as you may know it. But some people with learning disabilities are not comfortable with that term, and our view is that it should remain separate. Over the last 25 years, people with learning disabilities have made significant progress towards living independent lives in their communities. Today, the majority of people with learning disabilities live in mainstream housing in a place of their choosing. This is in stark contrast to the past, when the policy of institutionalisation marginalised people with learning disabilities. It isolated them from wider society and made them vulnerable to abuse. In the slides, you'll see pictures of Lennox Castle Hospital, where almost 1,700 people with learning disabilities lived. However, we know that some people with learning disabilities remain in institutional settings. Many people with learning disabilities face barriers to accessing suitable accommodation and are denied choice and control about where they live. We believe that accessible housing is crucial to ensuring people with learning disabilities, including those with complex needs, can live well in their communities and realise their right to independent living. Lindsay has some unique experience in her homes. Lindsay, you grew up in your family home. Do you want to tell us about your first experience of moving?
So when we are reaching our 20s, we often think about actually wanting our own space and own places. So when I was 28 years old, I was still living with family, and sometimes that could be difficult. The house we lived in had stairs, and I had to be creative to get about. So I often fell downstairs, and one time I fell out of bed and broke my ankle, and the doctor at the hospital said I'd actually surgically broken my own ankle. But I didn't need surgery because I did it myself. The house, so the house was a bungalow. My dad actually built the stairs himself. So at 28 years old, I was on a housing list waiting to be housed. And I read somewhere when I was thinking about accessibility, I was often denied that accessibility. And I had to be creative and make things myself. So I'd read somewhere about people in Africa using junk and recycling things to make wheelchairs. And I remember feeling like, I had to do the same. I had to think outside of the box. So home ownership turned into looking at a mortgage, because for people with a learning disability and a physical disability, there's not often a great choice of housing, and the wait can be very long. So I went down the route of a mortgage, and as you probably are aware, a mortgage is a big thing and it's very difficult to go through. People with a learning disability will often struggle with things like that. In my first flat that I bought, it was at a time I was having difficulties with family, and the family difficulties ended up forcing me to make a choice. But I thought I actually wanted to live beside family, but in hindsight, I feel like I should have had more choice. The first home was accessible for me because it had a ramp. I went with it basically for the ramp and inside of the house. So it was a big layout, enough for a turning space for a wheelchair. And this was at a time I was waiting on surgery. And it had a big kitchen as well. I loved that kitchen. The garden, although it was on the flat, it wasn't accessible because people kept on putting things they shouldn't down the drains. So it turned out not to be a good experience for my own private outdoor space. The flat was close to a bus stop to commute to work, the shop, days out and swimming. I used to be a competitive swimmer. It was also near a few shops and takeaways, and I often got a takeaway as a treat. So I used to go down in my electric wheelchair. I'd order and I'd pick it up and the owner would come out. So it had good community spirit. I stayed here for 1.5 years. So my second home had stairs again, but it was a bungalow. I don't know why they put stairs in bungalows when they're meant to be accessible. But it had a garden, so a front and a back garden. The garden was sloped, so it wasn't ideal. And where the house was situated, it was near absolutely nothing compared to my first house. So these are the things that benefit me and are accessible. So I would say for me, it would be access to a bus stop, access to good neighbours who are considerate, a good doctor's surgery, shops where they're easy to get to, they're easy to get in and out, an accessible bathroom, no fall risks. So it's thinking about the design of the bathroom. Is it going to be big enough to fit a wheelchair in? And also, as I mentioned before, good transport routes. So it's the area you're also thinking about. Is it on the flat? Does it have hills? So there are more things for people with disabilities that make it accessible, because as I said before, people with a learning disability are different and unique.
Thanks, Lindsay.
I think that's really great insights, and if you would like to find out more about Lindsay's experience, I encourage you to catch up with her at the break, because she's got lots of really good insights into her decision-making process and the obstacles that she's faced and what a suitable home means for her. I think what we can't forget here is that Lindsay is actually in a minority, in that most people with learning disabilities might not have control over their own money. They won't have support to make their own decisions and pick where they live. Some people will rely on social housing, and we often hear that people who are housed socially or don't feel safe in their homes. Some stats there just to give you an idea. In Scotland, there's approximately 125,000 adults living with a learning disability. The employment rate is estimated to be between 4 and 7%. And life expectancy is 20 years lower than the general population. I think we can all agree that those statistics really just reflect a lack of ambition that society has for people with learning disabilities. And with a different approach, this could certainly change.
So we're going to finish off with a quote. So the quote is up there, but I've written something different because I'm also a creative writer. So just knowing about the support someone requires and empowering them to feel in control is the first step to leading a full life. We might not get there all at the same pace. Everyone will reach their potential when they are ready. Growth is a process. It is not short, it is long. Be the route to someone's success and reap the seeds that grow new opportunities along the way. If you can get it right for people with disabilities, then you can get it right for everyone. Thank you for listening to our presentation today.
Sorry guys, that was the end, but I just want to do a shameless plug of the Human Rights Town app. There's lots of wee cards on the table there. Lindsay actually supported us in creating the app. The app was created for people with learning disabilities, with people with learning disabilities. So please download it and take a tour around Human Rights Town. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kyleigh Melville. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, based in the Morehouse School of Education and Sport. And I'm really excited to be here with you all today to tell you a bit about my experiences before I started my PhD. So before I started my PhD, I was a special education needs educator in England for the past 8 years. And in that time, I was able to work with a lot of different students, a lot of different needs, but predominantly nonverbal autism. So my presentation is going to be about designing multi-sensory environments in schools and what that means for neurodivergent students in practice. So I'll start a bit with the inspiration behind why I wanted to pursue this area for a PhD. So I was born and raised in Canada, and I moved to the UK almost 10 years ago. Crazy to imagine it's been that long already. And I've had the privilege of being able to not just being able to move abroad and living in the UK, but also just being able to travel across the UK, Europe, and abroad. And in my travels, I was able to see different ways of how designing accessibly means for different countries and regions. So some of the pictures I put up on the slide, one picture is of the Barbican Conservatory in London. It quickly became one of my favorite spots when I was a student there. I also have family in Singapore, so I put up a picture of the Marina Bay Gardens. They have fantastic plant life and water features, and it's one of the most stunning gardens in the world, I think. I've also put a picture of the Miffy Museum in Utrecht, which is a small city in the Netherlands. And that museum actually caters to children. So the entire building was designed specifically for children. So all the resources were child-friendly, a lot of the installations were at child height, and a lot of the installations just encouraged creativity and play. And finally, I put a picture of the Udi Library, which is in Helsinki in Finland. And they used very clever design tactics to somehow make different areas of engagement without necessarily putting up walls or barriers. So they would use more elevated or de-elevated floor planning, for example, to designate different areas depending on the age groups that would use the space. So all of these experiences that I've seen in my travels and then in my work just led me to the question of how can design impact human well-being and human regulation? And as an educator, I learned that it's very special when you can design to empower, but also to purposely embed sensory integration opportunities for the students. So working in schools, a common way that we can do that is through sensory circuits. The NHS defines sensory circuits as sensory-based movement activities that help children and young people achieve the just right level of alertness they need to prepare themselves for the day's learning. So when I was teaching my students, I would get them in a line and they would undergo a carousel formation. So they would start with an alerting activity. And an alerting activity is meant to activate the students' vestibular system and provide proprioceptive stimulation. And an example of that activity would be them jumping on a trampoline or balancing on a wobble board. They would then move on to do an organizing activity, and these activities are meant to activate the students' motor skills, balance, and sense of timing. And an example of that would be them aiming and throwing a ball at a target, or matching colored hoops on a colored pylon, as they call it. And then finally, the circuit would finish with a calming activity. And this would again activate the proprioceptive receptors in the student, but also involve deep pressure. So an example of a calming activity could be the student sitting down on a chair and being wrapped in a weighted blanket, or if they don't like deep pressure, then they can lie down on the floor and watch lighting features, for example. So sensory circuits are a good way to help the student feel calm, engaged, and ready to learn within their classroom environment. But depending on the level of need, as well as the additional need that a student can possess, sometimes they would need a separate space entirely to regulate themselves and be ready for learning. And these spaces in schools are commonly called sensory rooms. So what are sensory rooms like? Well, in my experience, they are very different depending on where you work, or in this case, where the student goes to school. So they're very different in terms of what they contain, what they look like, how big they are, and etc. And I've noticed personally that the biggest differences tend to be versus when the school is either private or publicly funded, and if it's a mainstream or a special needs provision. I've also noticed that whether a school decided to use existing structures within a building or design the room completely from scratch was highly dependent on the school's individual funding or the local authorities' funding. So there's a huge disparity in there as well. And I also noticed that how sensory rooms are used also differs between settings. So sometimes the sensory room can be used as a safe place to empower and stimulate a student, or it was used as a place to isolate and contain a student when they've been deemed to misbehave. So all of these differences across settings and the disparities to do with funding, it just led me to think about, why are sensory rooms used in the first place? And do they actually have a benefit for the students? And I even went a little bit deeper, and there are actually a lot of design companies specifically made to design these spaces. So I just took a sample of some of the photos from Rhino Sensory, a design company. And as you can see, they have these 4 different sensory rooms, and they can call it premium, basic, early years, adult. But when you look at the images, they're different, but they're not drastically different. And also, we don't know what informed those differences in design in the first place. But it's a great way to fill up the market because sensory rooms are increasingly being installed in schools as a form of standard resource for students with additional needs. However, as of now, there is no national or local guidance that is dictating these design considerations. So why does this all matter to me personally? Well, in my previous setting, I was tasked to redesign my school sensory room, and I only had one 200-pound Amazon voucher to do it. It was not enough. I'm telling you straight up, it was not enough. But it was a challenge, and I took it on with gusto. So I made a rough schematic using PowerPoint of what the existing space used to look like. So it was around a 6x4 foot room space, and it was the former closet that the janitor would use to clean the toilets on the lower floor. It was painted completely black, so with blackout paint. So if you close the door, no light can enter, and it was completely dark. And the black carpet on the floor had actually become unstuck. So now there was exposed tiling that a child could trip and hurt themselves on. And finally, it was really close to the lower school toilets and the main lower school hallway. So unfortunately, the room did often smell of wee, and all the sound from the hallway easily bled into the space. But I tried to redesign it, and that was the design I ended up coming up with. And hopefully, the short video will work. But yeah, from those two pictures, I can describe the room. So I repainted the walls a light blue, and I kind of went for an ocean under the sea vibe, because a lot of our children that tended to use the room were around 4 to 7 years of age. I added fish stickers. I put new soft tiling on the floor to cover up the exposed tiling. I added tactile boards and even just big plain, what are they called? Those mats you get in Lego sets where it's just a sheet. I would stick those to the wall as well to get some tactile stimulation that way. I also added fidget toys. There was a little bit of books in the corner for students that like to read. And I also installed a softer lighting feature because the existing feature was quite harsh, and it was harsh fluorescent. So I think for 200 pounds with an Amazon voucher, I think I did a pretty good job considering what the space looked like beforehand. And even though I did end up leaving that job at the end of that academic year, I was able to see tangible benefits for the students, but also the staff. So I'll start with the benefits. Okay. So first off, there was definitely a tangible benefit of the new space for our nonverbal students, especially. Our nonverbal students had the tendency to want to be crushed in a ball or hide under blankets, or just go somewhere that they couldn't be seen. So when they were brought into this room, they immediately felt more calm and more regulated. I also noticed that students, like even older students, were eager and excited to use the space, and they would request to use it more often. I also noticed that it was a good place to apply our zones of regulation as well as our occupational therapy strategies. So we worked really closely with our in-house therapy team because a lot of our students had a lot of additional needs in that capacity. So it was a good space for the therapy team to get involved as well. And because it was on the first floor of the school, it was accessible to all students. So even our students with physical challenges or mobility needs were able to use the space as well. And finally, it was just a nice place for us to use our de-escalation strategies with the students if we couldn't do it within the classroom. Unfortunately, there were some cons, and I think some of the cons happened after I left the school, but I stayed in contact with some of my colleagues and they were able to feed back to me on that front. So firstly, a lot of the toys that I'd put in there, they were stolen or broken. And actually a lot of the sensory activating resources, they were actually permanently moved from the sensory room into classrooms. I don't know who moved them, but they definitely weren't based in the sensory room anymore. I was also told that the walls were heavily defaced, so students had gone in and ripped off the stickers and even started to rip off the paint using pencils or scissors. Because the space was so small, if a student or multiple students wanted to use the space, it would quickly result in overcrowding, and then that would also overstimulate the students, which had led to longer periods of dysregulation. There was also unclear communication amongst the staff of when to actually bring the students to that space. Was it when the staff member decided to, or was it when the student asked the staff member, can I be brought to that space? So it just wasn't really clear of when to use that space. And finally, when it came to the damages, there was a lack of accountability of whose responsibility is it to maintain that space? Is it just the staff? Is it just the students? Or is it both? So hearing about what happened to the room after I left did leave me feeling a little bit frustrated because I put a lot of effort and I saw the benefit it had for our students. But it did leave me with some important takeaways that I could then bring into doing my PhD research. So firstly, monitoring sensory environments is just as essential as monitoring learning environments. Because it is a part of the school environment, educators should pay as much attention to its maintenance just as much as their classrooms. Secondly, there needs to be clear guidance on when, why, and how to use multisensory environments effectively and safely in schools. And before I go on to the third point, I just want to draw your attention to the picture on the slide. So this is a picture of the classroom where I taught early years and Key Stage 1 students. I only had 4 students, and I had 3 TAs. So it was a 1 adult to 1 child ratio. Now, looking at that photo, you may think that's a lot of stuff for just 4 kids. But in actuality, myself and my teaching team, we often thought we didn't have enough of resources for our 4 kids. Some of our resources would break days after we bought it for the children. So this leads me to the point of that there needs to be greater consideration towards the quality, type, and access to stimuli we embed into the design of our classrooms and our sensory environments. And finally, I want to finish with saying that sensory rooms or multi-sensory environments in schools, they're not a one-size-fits-all solution because every child is different and every child has a different strategy of how they can cope and feel good in school. And under no circumstances should educators force students to use that space if they don't want to and if it doesn't empower them in school. So I think there's been some more discussion in the literature about making national guidance and standardized framework on how to design these spaces. But even when that comes to pass, it is still imperative that we make the child's right to a safe learning environment at the core of designing that guidance. So I was thankfully able to receive funding from the Economic Social Research Council to do my PhD on exploring multisensory environments in schools. And these are my 3 research questions that I hope to answer in the time it takes me to finish. And I'm hoping to be using participatory action research methods. And this is a type of research that where the data collection, the design, and the way I carry out my research is heavily informed by the students and the practitioners that I will meet along the way. And I specifically want to try and get the experiences of students with additional communication challenges, partly because of my background in working in nonverbal autism, but I also think that neurodivergence, as we previously covered, is such a huge term, and a lot of students and young people can fall under that umbrella. But lately in the literature, there is a propensity to focus mainly on autistic students, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we are leaving out a lot of other vulnerable communities that fall within that community. So that's going to be one of my priorities in carrying out my research. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I've put my email, my Twitter, and my work ID at the bottom if you'd like to get in touch. And just a slight promotion. My master's thesis is being published next month, so if you want to read it, it's about my experiences of working with autistic students and how they experience Lego-based therapy in school. So if you'd like to read that as well, just give me a shout, and thank you for having me.
Hello. Sorry, like I don't have a nice, um, fancy slideshow for you, so you're just gonna have to look at me. Sorry. So I'm here to talk about my like experience and the as a physically disabled full-time musician. So so I do not have a do not have a learning disability, but I have faced lots of challenges because of my physical disability in my work and being self-employed as well. So yeah, so I'm gonna just chat like a little bit about that. Well, part of my work is to work with like young people who do have learning disabilities. And I do this with like an organization called Live Music Now. And this is really shown me how music really is uh universal communicator, and how people can express themselves so freely through music, and how you get that connection as well that some people don't find in many other settings. And something which I feel is really key to the work I do is I play live. Like I am there in the room playing my like instrument. So it's not just random noises coming out of the CD player. Like I'm right here. And that shows that the music comes from real people to real people. And that like everybody can do it. You don't need to be trained. Like I'm technically I'm not trained. Like I don't even know anything like music theory or none of that stuff. I just play. And that is such an important thing for that human connection, I think. So live music in any setting can really make somebody's day like pretty good. So yeah, so for me that I like how I navigate being self-employed with a disability. Like I don't have a PA, I just got really good pals that help me out really. So I play the harp which you'll see later on, which, as you can imagine, not the most transportable thing, particularly for someone like me, which I am, and someone not very good on their feet. So I do need to think about how I get my heart to my performances, like, because I can't just pick it up and walk out the door and get there. And thankfully, I do work with a lot of great people who send someone to come and get me or something, but really I do rely on my friends, which is kind of annoying because there's no, well, so far I've not found like an infrastructure that I can make use of to really help me in that way, getting my heart from my flat to my performance. But then even when I get to the gig, you got the venue, right? Venues are, particularly in Glasgow, most of the time they're down like underneath a pub or like above something. And this is really annoying. Because it means stairs, it means taking the heart downstairs, getting me downstairs, and but then again, that is the venues that we have to work with. So my mindset is, okay, that's the venue. How do we make this more accessible? One of the ways that like I think is so great and such a simple thing to do. Like as someone who performs and someone who goes to a lot of concerts and stuff is communication, right? We could just say something is accessible or something is not. What does that mean? To me, that is really not helpful. Just to say this is an accessible venue. This is not. Because accessibility is different for everyone. And someone who is in a wheelchair, they might need a ramp. For me, like a ramp is actually more kind of annoying. So that's not the same need. So communication, just telling people what the access is. Don't make the decision for them. This is accessible. You just say there are so many steps to get in here. Then you go a flight of stairs, something like that. Then we can make up our own mind. Disabled people are people. We have to make these decisions for ourselves. And if I want to go to a gig, I'm gonna find a way to get there. And something that means getting carried up a flight of stairs. Like I'll do that. But that's my choice. I'm not like I really want that.